thank you all for inviting me to speak to you today, and to the whole ARKWORK community really for collectively convening a project around such a challenging topic, critically reflecting on the production of archaeological knowledge as a practice. While ARKWORK collectively and through the work of the individuals gathered under its umbrella has tackled this crucial question of how and why we work and how our knowledge work shapes and is shaped by its own context across a diverse range of practices, from the impacts of fieldwork methods for gathering physical evidence for past activities, through to how we display and communicate about artifacts in museums and collections, I will attempt to explore these same central questions through my own long-term engagement with airborne LiDAR within the domains of landscape archaeology and more recently heritage work, which places the archaeological understandings of the landscape we produce into the context of contemporary debates and values. Now, at its most basic, aerial LiDAR is a survey technique that facilitates the practice of archaeological topographic recording, analysis, and interpretation over extensive areas of the landscape. And when the first aerial LiDAR surveys revealing archaeological remains appeared in the literature in the early 2000s, there was a real sense of magic about them, and particularly the results from forested landscapes. So essentially, it is important to recall that aerial LiDAR produces a point cloud that describes the objects on the surface of the Earth and the surface itself. So it's 3D data at another scale. The points are classified into categories based on the objects they describe, so vegetation, built structures, the ground surface, and this enables the virtual removal of forest cover. And subsequently, this bare earth surface can be modeled digitally, which lets us visualize very small elevation differences and recognize and interpret archaeological remains with topographic expressions. Now, the unprecedented scale and speed of the technology for recording and making legible archaeological remains as expressed through their surface topography, combined with the ability to see through the woodland canopy, which together allowed researchers to produce these really crisp plan views of the details of archaeological features continuously across both forested and open areas in a way that was effectively impossible to achieve on the ground, really did seem self-evidently revolutionary at the time. And much as aerial photography completely changed the scale and speed of archaeological discovery when it emerged as a mainstay of practice in the early 20th century, the large quantity of new discoveries made with LiDAR really changed our approach. Now, this increase in the quantity of known features was particularly marked in forests, which were and remain notoriously difficult to survey using the suite of terrestrial methods commonly applied in open landscapes, such as geophysical prospection and intensive surface survey, such as we practice in the Mediterranean, and in which spectral aerial imaging equally is ineffective due to the presence of tree canopy. So with the advent of aerial LiDAR, the work that would have taken years to accomplish with previously available survey methods really became a matter of months, allowing the treatment at unprecedented high spatial resolutions of areas at the scale of hundreds of square kilometers. Further, these discoveries are qualitatively viewed to have added value because they're precisely located, and the morphology in both plan and relief of the features detected is characterized with great detail. And the diversity of structures discovered under the contemporary forest cover likewise provides added value because they represent types of practices and structures of which examples were rarely found in excavation or survey in the non-forested landscape. So all of this produced data with what we could call considerable curve appeal. Now, more subtly, archaeologists recognized an advantage and added value in the practice of identifying and characterizing features as part of an assemblage, spatial or temporal. And all this considered with the advent of LiDAR, it was widely held that now, finally, information on the presence of archaeological remains in forests, on their type, character, and distribution would be readily, if expensively, available. And thus, archaeology of these forests and their role in the broader landscape would be better understood. So this brings us to my question of today, which is, some 20 years later, does this promise seem fulfilled? Now, undeniably, the amount of information on the presence and character of archaeological remains preserved in forests linked to human engagement with these landscapes in the past is greatly increased. In the Forêt Chailloux, where I've worked with Laure Nunager, Catherine Fouchard, Aurore Dupont, Olivier Giraclose, and many other colleagues, we found extensive evidence for production of lime and charcoal, with many examples dating from the 18th century, some replacing the clear evidence of small Gallo-Roman farms we saw in my slide a moment ago. And colleagues working in the Black Forest investigating a different distribution of charcoal platforms, many dating to a similar period of slightly different construction, let us start to launch these interpretive discussions about different social and economic strategies for fuel production, different patterns of consumption, and comparisons between these regions. In another important study, Michel Redet's regional synthesis of the latent late antique rural landscapes in northeastern France, so the Rurland project. The project team drew on the LiDAR data available through multiple surveys to integrate forested areas into their study of patterns of settlement and land use, and to investigate areas which in the past were under cultivation as part of their regional synthesis. But we always knew that charcoal was produced in forests in the 18th century in quantity, and of course in periods dating back to the Bronze Age. And importantly, we also always knew that there were field systems preserved in places under forest landscapes. So the question is, how do we make new archaeological knowledge out of all of this data? How do we use it to enable ourselves to pose new questions, shift our perceptions, change how we interpret forest landscapes, to work at different temporal and spatial scales than those addressed through the approaches widely applied through environmental archaeology, refining our chronological and locational lens to a more human scale, and simultaneously go beyond what is known from archival and historical ecological studies. To date, I'm going to suggest our success in doing this, doing what we all actually want to do, having been exhorted to not simply gather more endless dots or other bits of data to create meaningless plots or graphs, to misquote Rob Witcher's 2006 article title, has been rather mixed. In the context of archaeological LiDAR, given all the attractiveness of the images produced and the cost of procuring the data, if it is not demonstrably contributing to the creation of substantial new knowledge, this feels rather a letdown. We feel, implicitly, that something so glamorous, expensive, and beautiful and new really should have a real impact. So somewhere out there, a reviewer is muttering value for money. And perhaps this is simply a matter of expectations management. Gabriele Gattiglia, Neha Gupta, Mark McCoy, Andy Dufton, and Parker Van Valkenburg, Alison Mickle, who I think I've seen here today, and of course Jeremy Huggett, have all grappled with the implications of big data for archaeology, posing as many questions as they're providing answers about how we can learn to work with it and what we can really expect of having it. And while this is the case, without explicitly drawing on archaeological LiDAR's perhaps limited and local insights, the core of the discourse around forests and human engagements with them has shifted significantly since the early 2000s. So why isn't LiDAR seemingly explicitly informing this shift, at least not in a way that I can see in reports and the research literature? And is LiDAR then perhaps implicitly feeding into this shift in a way that's more difficult to discern? Really, what is going on here in our processes of knowledge production and knowledge communication? First, we should perhaps say that we are not surprised to find the core problems of archaeological knowledge production, which this community has set itself out to investigate, apply as much to our expensively collected and beautifully visualized data as they do to seemingly inexpensively surveyed scruffy potsherds and lithics. So a closer look at the interpretive and analytical processes in which archaeological LiDAR work is entangled reveals the fingerprints of quite a few of archaeology's stickier knowledge production problems, many shared with field walking surveys as carried out in Mediterranean Europe, nicely recently summarized in an article by Peter Ottema and colleagues. bringing together insights and reflections from a group who have battled the vagaries of survey for 30 years, with aerial surveys carried out in Northern Europe as researchers like my colleague Dave Cowley at Historic Environment Scotland, and with geospatial analyses by researchers too numerous to attempt to name. All archaeological methods which are arguably equally struggling to produce outcomes satisfying to their practitioners. So in looking briefly at these problems, but also at the real impacts archaeological LiDAR is having in spite of them, I hope to unpick some of the tangles today in how we are making archaeological knowledge. So key here is that we want new knowledge, either a response to a specific research question or a new overarching shared understanding of how a certain landscape area or type works. In my own case, I want to know how and where past interactions manifest themselves and how people, tools, soil, water, trees, insects, and animals tie together to continually make and remake forests. This is a subject about which we are informed by multiple sources, by historical maps, pollen cores, fossil beetles, modeling of plant successions, and we want to elaborate, refine, shift, or perhaps perturb this existing picture. We want to know when human impacts on forests become irreversibly or long-term detrimental. We want to know what a forest means in different societies, what it means for communities today, how it came to be, and what its characteristics are that imbue it with that meaning. So the proverbial character of the character landscape. And what we want to know from archaeological is shaped, I would argue, by the impactful turn in archaeology. And I'm going to make a distinction here between the ethical turn, in that it directly engages with politics, as called for example, in the critique of archaeology's ethical turn put forward by Yannis Hamalakis and Philip Duke in Archaeology and Capitalism: From Ethics to Politics. This impactful turn, I argue, has drawn considerably increased disciplinary attention to subjects such as human-environment interactions as an object lesson for a society struggling to come to grips with our own environment and climate actions and interactions, and the contemporary social value of heritage landscapes. We also want other things: that this knowledge be produced in a way that is ethical, reflects our individual and shared values, represents diverse perspectives and ways of knowing, that its making creates work which is satisfying, and its doing allows us to feel we are contributing to responding to the big issues of the day. The growing concern with the making of knowledge in the sense of the ethics of its production appears in the work of scholars like Sarah Perry and Lorna Richardson, and is being taken up by a new generation of researchers like Claire Boardman, Francesco Dolcetti, and Megan Dennis, and will no doubt be discussed again today in the roundtable on Industry Forum on Contract Archaeology, and I know has come up before in the context of ARKWORK's own efforts. So we're going to come back later to the impacts of the social and societal context in which we are formulating these questions. But we're going to start in the beginning, because while archaeology's impactful turn, I'm suggesting, was moving the questions and changing the orientation of our research, how the work actually gets done remained rather mired in, we might say mired up to the eyeballs and therefore blinded by the usual problems of knowledge production inherent in archaeological methods. Now, some of these are what Isto Huvila has characterized as processual problems that can be managed, while others are the ones that remain unsolvable because they are at the heart of archaeological inquiry. The interpretive practice of archaeological LiDAR launched itself in a community influenced by traditional survey practice, by GIS, by aerial archaeology, and inherited visual interpretation practices from all of these, and particularly from the aerial imaging community as a consequence, with many users aiming to get our 3D data into a form where it can be interpreted like an air photo or satellite image. Although my own work has looked at visualization alternatives, carrying out interpretation in VR environments, and you see some of our fantastic Glasgow students doing that here. We really begin with the interpretation of individual features visually in all archaeological LiDAR work. And in doing so, we encounter observer bias in old chestnut. Now, attempts in the context sheet with which you are all familiar, or other pro forma, to scaffold from the most basic of visual observations and measurements to higher level interpretations to add rigor have been extensively critiqued in archaeological practice. Individual knowledge in archaeology, expert interpretation can take a form of transcendental empiricism, a logic of immanence as described by Deleuze. Now, oddly, this kind of careful scaffolding never really garnered quite the same serious attention in the aerial archaeology community, where practice has relied heavily on individual expertise. And if we had a pub to go to later, that's where I'd be telling you to ask me why this is, how I think it's embedded in early links to military uses of aerial imagery, and the need for identifications in the context of combat to be certain, even when they weren't. So as the individual expert interpreter problems are well known in aerial imagery, the usual solutions have been proposed: multiple observers, consistent training, assessment of confidence, all I would argue with limited benefit. And this leads us to the current state of play, which is that in the past 5 years, AI, artificial intelligence, has re-emerged onto the scene. And practitioners working with archaeological LiDAR have been early in the adoption of AI approaches to facilitate automated detection, borrowing from work in the wider remote sensing community. This has led to a good deal of concern over training data creation and the problem of whether the AI will simply reproduce our existing interpretive biases. Archaeological LiDAR practitioners, in attempting to address this problem, sit squarely in the debate over expertise versus the crowd versus the AI algorithm. Increasingly, it is seen to seek to use them in combination, and we see this in Karsten Lamber's work and Wouter van der Schoof's work using crowdsourcing in AI, trying to balance expert quality control with contextualization to filter potential outputs. So broadly, all of this has really reopened the question of justification of expert judgment. So this is that school days exhortation to show your work. But AI image interpretation operates differently here. As usual, archaeological knowledge production is not alone in its problems, and recent work in the wider image-based AI detection sphere on interpretability or explainability provides both potentially useful tools and a real caution about our ability to interrogate the contribution of individual pieces of prior thinking or knowledge to new reasoning or conclusions when we are using artificial intelligence. So should we go back to first principles of archaeological knowledge construction in designing how we're going to engage between archaeological LiDAR and AI? Maybe so. And beyond these observer bias concerns about making an accurate identification, these methods have, outside archaeology from where we borrowed them, been the subject of substantial recent debate, as the real dangers posed by implicit bias around race and gender built into AI systems rose into the public consciousness. Now, our broad cultural awareness that what we put into these systems and who is involved in designing them are not unproblematic have yet to really translate into the work being done on archaeological LiDAR, although my doctoral student, Lucy Florin, is starting to think along these lines in her PhD research. Ethical AI, design justice, and the interpretation of archaeological LiDAR to produce archaeological knowledge intersect in ways in which we're really only beginning to unpick. And I'll therefore suggest that we must pay attention also to paradigms which might appear more innocuous and therefore perfectly acceptable to our archaeological practice or our broader modern society, accepted because we take them in without even imagining other possible paradigms. Visual interpretation of different features also takes the form of classification problems and attempts to solve them with ontologies. These are well known, especially to this audience. So I'm simply going to highlight that archaeological LiDAR equally shares problems of classification with other forms of survey and attempts to define and name types of things and put them in relation to one another. Equally familiar is the problem that pots and mounds don't equal people, as archaeologists were interested in the processes and activities which produce observable signatures in the landscape beyond the signatures themselves. And my work with Laure Nunager and Philip Verhagen to address this with ontologies, formally modeling connections between descriptions of topographic situations with domain assumptions about their sources, as captured in the regional literature, is a deeply imperfect attempt to surface the implicit assumptions we build into this particular inferential step of our processes. Now, in combination, these two problems, classification and translation between observable outcome and activity and process, is problematic because the classification codifies and fossilizes the dominant and often implicit paradigms used in our transcendental empiricism style translation in a way that further masks them. Classifications, like other information infrastructures, are products of the values and paradigms of their times. They incorporate and ossify them, carrying them quietly forward into the future. We're all too familiar with the idea that classificatory systems, which describe the interests of a city's landowners rather than those of the itinerant charcoal burners in their categorical terms, reinforce power structures by only making space for certain types of official knowledge. And these are issues explored by scholars like Craig Cipolla and Simon Holdaway, working on indigenous worldviews and archaeological ontologies, and more broadly by people like Kisha Supernant, Geneva Baxter, Natasha Lyons, and Sonia Altalay in their Archaeologies of the Heart. And all of this isn't even specific to forests, except, and this is an important except, that we both know just enough and just little enough about forests and our long-term and short-term human interactions with them to be both able and required to make some pretty big inferential leaps, and for there to be plenty of room for theorization and interpretive disagreement at multiple levels. So they provided a research context where, at the spatial and temporal scale at which archaeological LiDAR proposed to contribute, situated between contributions from environmental archaeology and historical ecology, the perceived gaps were big enough to make space for the possibility of new real insights. So in forests, at least in the European context, we have the space to swing. This returns us to the context in which archaeological LiDAR and archaeological knowledge is being produced. Archaeologists in caricature are methodological magpies, borrowing techniques from diverse fields. The import we give to our work and the framing of our questions are likewise porous, absorbing and binding with broader intellectual trends. This is not a new statement, of course. Alison Wiley has long suggested the need to construct new models of inquiry to engage the diverse perspectives and problems of the contemporary world through archaeological knowledge work. Equally important, then, is that society at large, at least in the global Northwest, had launched into a renewed effort to rethink forests and our society's relationship with them in the context of the current debate on climate and environmental crises, broadly in parallel with the maturation of archaeological LiDAR. And we've seen this bleeding forward into all sorts of projects, from Page's efforts to map past global land use to SCAPE, looking at the impacts of climate change on coastal erosion and the preservation of sites. The established understanding in archaeology of how forests are has been developed through long and extensive research on the paleo and historic environments, emerging from research perspectives from environmental archaeology and history. And forests are tied up with these questions of land use, clearance, spread of agriculture, changes in population size, and the introduction of economic activities making demand on specific resources. The realized and potential impact of LiDAR on our understanding of the characters of forests sits within this research landscape and the broader social discourse on individual and collective relationships that we have or can imagine having with forests. So this is really coming back to these questions of the temporal and spatial scale and the uncertainty of features identified, sampling biases, and how we integrate multiple lines of evidence. So we don't have time to go into all of this today in detail, and I'll note that our potential impact on our responses to specific established research questions is dependent on developing methods and models which will allow us to deal with archaeological LiDAR's versions of the usual survey-related problems discussed a few moments ago. So I'm going to turn instead to the impact archaeological LiDAR has had on the questions we're asking about forests. And here, the sheer scale and obviousness of the remains uncovered has prompted a significant shift. Without yet having figured out how to satisfyingly deploy these data, overcoming the hurdles of temporal uncertainty, sampling bias, etc., the fact that there are undeniably many more and more diverse human impacts on forests and more varied trajectories than was commonly thought in our collective conception has encouraged the development of a new suite of questions. How did a community's engagement with their forest change over time? Can we see evidence of intentional management of a forest like we see for farmed landscapes, but on a forest timescale? Can we see clear links between past interventions and current biomes? How do we envisage individually and as a society the practical socioeconomic and socio-ecological management of forests? This development of new questions is embedded in the glamour of the data itself, but has equally been encouraged by the opening up of the desired outcomes of research implied by impactful archaeology's shift in the value of different aspects of research practice, which elevates the importance of our ability to influence public conceptions. And das Lausikas Kostas Dallas, Susie Thomas, and others in work group 3 of the ARKWORK community have explored the business of what they call archaeology-related non-professional knowledge work, which I see as operating in this space carved out by impactful archaeology between professional archaeological communities and global communities interested in archaeology avocationally. So, for example, in France, to locate the impact of archaeological research and archaeological LiDAR on our collective understanding of past and present forest landscapes and the kinds of questions we're asking, it's necessary to briefly review the institutional and intellectual context of this work. The framework in which LiDAR surveys were proposed and run has roots from at least the mid-19th century, when the national legal and institutional framework for forest management came into place, early national mapping started, and ideas of human-environment relationships still found in the academic literature and public conception today became influential. And attempts to regulate and the use and management of forests, including the establishment of state-controlled forests, date to at least the 18th century, with a basis in earlier medieval rulings, which established the aristocracy's control over forested land and, importantly, the resources on it in perpetuity. And Colbert's ordinances, which you see here, cemented these rules, legitimizing the idea of a contemporary forest that was greatly reduced and under serious threat. This sounds familiar today. And these were all established to create a sustainable management strategy, but also to assure the economic and military needs of the state of France were met. Now, to meet the requirements of this system, owners of forests relevant to the needs of the public domain were given responsibilities for preservation, sustainable management, and access. But in reality, they've made forests the private property of the state or communities that control the exploitation and access by the public. So, for example, the right of affouage to take wood from the forest for domestic use, such as heating, is only conceded to people living in the community that own the forest and only under certain circumstances. So the forests, especially public forests, while intended to be, are not really a commonly held good to be used by all for certain activities. The perception of the right to use forests is progressively disappearing, particularly with a reduction in practices like this one. So consequently, for most people, the forest now represents a natural space where we come to relax, recharge, and reconnect with nature. So research in and on forests inherently operates with and is affected by this context. So equal to the effect the real roles of forests play in their national, social, economic, and political spheres is the effect of the public perception of forests, the kinds of spaces they're understood to be and how they're valued. Picking up again on the work of Work Group 3, we can frame this process as a form of knowledge creolization. A primary challenge then is redressing the wide gap between the imagined forest and its reality. In short, we are redescribing forests past through present in a new framework so that their role in the contemporary landscape and society may be reimagined. And here's where the richness of the description and visual depiction provided by LiDAR comes to the fore. In sum, while we haven't yet overcome the usual bugbears of professional archaeological knowledge production to provide new answers, archaeological LiDAR has been shifting public, and researchers are part of this public, perception of forests in places like France, not least through the spectacular visual evidence through which it has appeared on television, online, and in the popular press. So while environmental archaeology had long successfully painted a picture in the research community of significant changes over the long term of forests in interaction with human activity, and historical research had made it very, very clear that society has long held an active interest in the management and use of forests, the sheer visual illustration of the extent of human impact on forested landscapes introduces a new level of cognitive dissonance about what constitutes our imagined to be natural landscapes. The obviousness and undeniability of the widespread and heterogeneous human impacts in areas that are now forested, immediately graspable as taking place on human-lived timescales, is in the context of an impactful archaeology a real step change. The archaeological knowledge produced, while imperfect and uncertain, remaining impressionistic in a way that may frustrate precision and certainty-seeking researchers, does change our impression. It compels us to put aside oversimplifications about deforestation, reforestation, and resilience, and ask how the accumulation of diverse activities related to these forests as multifunctional milieu helps to compose their present-day character, investigating the stability and variability of forest dynamics. It may, ironically, be a context particularly well suited for using inevitably incomplete and uncertain archaeological data to produce knowledge that is valuable and valued today. These reflections on the context, practices, and partial successes of knowledge production with archaeological LiDAR highlight the tight interconnections between contemporary public conversations, received perception and premises, our general impression of things we all know, and archaeological practice. And while very much de rigueur, I'll suggest that we should seriously consider all the implications of this current recentering, which is putting practices of knowledge creation conventionally peripheral to professional archaeology, so these creolizing practices, at the very heart of what we do. I will close by asking how, in this context, we want to collectively and individually shape our archaeological knowledge work to make it be both more integrally and less exclusively archaeological. So this is a call for consideration and also for action, which I know has been taken up by this community and which I look forward to hearing explored further today. And I'm happy to take any questions.